Christianity is the largest religion in the world. It traces its roots back to ancient Israel and the worship of Yahweh. Most people assume that this tradition was always monotheistic, that from the beginning Israel believed in one God and rejected all others. But what if I tell you that this wasn't always the case? What if the earliest Israelites were polytheists, lived in a world filled with many gods? What if Yahweh himself emerged from a religious landscape that looked very different from the one described by later Judaism or Christianity? For a long time these ideas were dismissed, but over the last century, archaeologists, historians and biblical scholars have uncovered evidence that paints a very different picture. In this video, we will explore the pagan origins of the god worshipped by billions today. Let's begin. What is the official story? The one that Jews and Christians believe about the origin of Israel and its national god, Yahweh. According to the Old Testament, the descendants of Abraham lived in Egypt, where they were enslaved by the Pharaoh. One day, Yahweh appeared to Moses, who then, with his help, liberated the earliest Israelites and led them out of Egypt. Yahweh gave them commandments, a covenant, and a land to occupy. After a long series of hiccups, they reached the promised land, Canaan, where a bunch of pagans lived. God commanded to take over the land and genocide the Canaanites. So they did. And this is how Israel begins and how Yahweh becomes its national god. A lovely story. But did this happen? Not quite. The scholarly narrative has shifted significantly over the past century as archaeological evidence has accumulated. Earlier reconstructions often relied more heavily on biblical texts, whereas contemporary scholarship places greater emphasis on archaeological evidence. Of course, in earlier times, we didn't have that much archaeological evidence, so that's why they relied more heavily on the biblical narrative. But in modern times, for example, Mark S. Smith, in his 2002 second edition of the Early History of God, argues that contrary to biblical narrative, material culture shows a strong continuity between Canaanites and Israelites. Pottery, houses, storage jars, burial customs, and other cultural features in the Iron Age 1 continue earlier Canaanite traditions. So much so that Smith even points out that archaeologists didn't have a reliable set of criteria to distinguish whether a site is Israelite or Canaanite. In many cases, they simply can't tell the difference. Even inscriptions aren't helpful, since the early Hebrew is so close to the Canaanite languages. So yeah, Smith is kind of beating around the bush here, but William G. Deve is more confident and more blunt. In his 2017 book, he basically says that Israelites were not foreign invaders into Canaan, but a group that emerged from the indigenous population of the region, that is, from within Canaan itself. So basically, we can say that Israelites were Canaanites, overwhelmingly. But why does this matter to us? It's not because we want to vehemently contradict the Bible. At least, the Canaanites were not genocided. That's one upside, but joking aside, beyond the archaeological evidence, which is already very strong, there is something that is even more compelling and fascinating in my opinion, and that is the comparative religious evidence. Like how similar the beliefs and the gods of the early Israelites were to the so-called evil and pagan Canaanites.
Clans of Canaanites were extremely evil. They were debauched morally and opposed God.
Pretty similar, actually. So let's see what the Canaanites believed in. It was a fairly typical ancient Near Eastern polytheistic belief system. They had a divine family, a pantheon of gods, a four-tier system where at the top, in the first tier, stood the Most High, El, an elderly wise bearded figure, supreme God, creator and father of gods and humans. Alongside him was his consort, Asherah, the mother of gods. So this was the top of the divine family. Then, the second tier was occupied by the sons of God and other major deities, like Baal, for example, a fierce warrior god whose titles include storm god, rain giver, cloud rider. This tier includes other gods also, like Anat, Ashtarte, Yam, and many more. The third tier was made up of specialist gods, divine craftsmen, architects, smiths, and builders, the ones who constructed palaces and forged divine weapons. And for the fourth and lowest tier was made up of messengers and servants of gods who carried out orders and delivered messages. And if you read your Bible closely, this starts to get eerily familiar. You know what? Let's read the Bible, specifically Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8 to 9. When the Most High, Elyon, allotted peoples for inheritance, when he divided up humanity, he fixed the boundaries for peoples, according to the number of the divine sons. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob, his own inheritance. Did you catch that? The Most High, El, divided up the nations between divine sons and allotted Yahweh his own portion. What? There is a God above Yahweh called El, the Most High, who has multiple sons, and Yahweh is one of them? A bit familiar, isn't it? Just like the Canaanite version. No, if you are wondering what translation I'm using, because you double-checked it, which you should, by the way, and yours might look a bit different, I'm using a scholarly translation by Mark S. Smith from his book The Origins of the Biblical Monotheism. This translation comes from the oldest manuscripts we have from Deuteronomy, the Greek Septuagint and the Hebrew text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's very important which versions of the text you are using, or which manuscripts your Bible was translated from, because there are a number of both modern translations and ancient manuscript copies that shifted the wording slightly here and there, sometimes for theological reasons, sometimes simply by mistake. There is a great example for this exact verse we just read. From the Masoretic text from roughly the 7th and the 10th centuries, this authoritative Hebrew translation replaces sons of God with sons of Israel, from Bene Elohim to Bene Israel. And you can see throughout the Bible, across centuries, these kind of subtle anti-polytheistic changes. In other words, they represent an evolution in theology. What is even more fascinating is that this evolution of belief not only appears as manipulating of manuscripts, but shows up as narrative development in the Bible itself. For example, it's preserved in texts like Psalm 82. For this, I couldn't find a full translation from Smith, so I will supplement it with the Jewish Study Bible. But I will clearly mark which is which. God, Elohim, stands in the divine assembly of El, Adat El. Amongst the divinities, Elohim, he pronounces judgment. How long will you judge perversely, showing favor to the wicked, Shaleh? Judge the wretched and the orphan, vindicate the lowly and the poor, rescue the wretched and the needy, save them from the hand of the wicked. They neither know nor understand, they go about in darkness, all the foundation of the earth totter. I myself presume that you are gods, sons of the Most High, Elyon. Like humans you will die, and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the world, for you inherit all the nations. What's so interesting is that this is not just a simple anti-polytheistic polemic. It doesn't fully reject the old theology. Instead, it assumes it as its common knowledge. It's simply accept the high god El, who calls together his sons, the second-tier gods of the pantheon, for an assembly where he rebukes them for being incompetent. And in this very scene, Yahweh is appointed as the leader of all nations instead. This is clearly a later theological development, a transition towards a single God. And what is absolutely fascinating is that here we can actually see the evolution of Yahweh. And not just that, but a literal evolutionary missing link, an in-between state, a transition from polytheism towards monotheism, preserved right inside the Bible itself. The divine assembly portrayed here is very similar to the Canaanite one, but there are some slight differences. The Israelite pantheon is divided into 3 tiers. The first tier is the same, occupied by El and Asherah. You heard it right, the Israelite high god also had a wife. Asherah was a motherly figure and a fertility goddess, and there is extensive archaeological evidence for her cultic veneration. Around 3,000 Asherah figures have been found throughout the region. She was so widespread and respected that statues associated with her were even set up in the temple of God. She also appears in the Old Testament itself, in multiple places, although these references are later polemics against her, much like the examples we looked at earlier. But that is what it makes it so fascinating. Centuries later, in a much more monotheistic era, anti-polytheistic writers tried to dismiss her worship, yet doing so they ended up preserving evidence for it in the Bible. The same thing happened with Baal. He was a warrior god and a storm god, much like Yahweh. Both occupied a second tier of the Israelite pantheon. Beside them, there were plenty of other gods in this tier, but for the sake of time, let's just skip past them. One major difference between the Israelite and the Canaanite or Ugaritic pantheon is that the Israelite version had 3 tiers instead of 4. The 2 lowest tiers basically got smashed together. If you remember, in the Canaanite version, the lowest tier was occupied by messengers and servants of the gods. The same role exists in the Israelite 3rd tier as well, although you are probably more familiar with the term angels. Yes, in fact, the word angel literally means messenger or attendant of God. So yes, the 3rd tier of the Israelite pantheon was occupied by angels. And I'm sure by now you can see some of the parallels between the 2 belief systems. The next logical question is, yeah, but what happened to all these gods? Where did they go? The answer is kind of strange. They didn't exactly disappear. They got absorbed by Yahweh. You will see what I mean in a moment. Let's start with Baal. As I mentioned earlier, Baal and Yahweh were already pretty similar to begin with. But over time, Yahweh absorbed many of Baal's characteristics. For example, both are warrior gods, mountain gods, storm gods, cloud riders, controllers of rain and lightning, and both defeated chaos and sea monsters, and so on. Here is a table of comparison with the relevant Bible verses, so you can double-check it that I'm not making this up. I know this sounds hard to believe at first. It's a lot to take in, especially if you're a Christian. When you look at this, it's no wonder why Yahweh and Baal ended up competing with each other. This rivalry and Yahweh's eventual victory is preserved in the famous story of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18. And this is yet another example of something we have already seen with Asherah and the Divine Council, a later claim of theological supremacy being projected back into the tradition. What about El, the high god? After the Divine Council scene, where El appoints Yahweh as the king of all nations, El and Yahweh gradually get merged into one deity. So Yahweh takes on his characteristics as well. Supreme God, Most High, creator of the world and humanity, wise elderly figure, judge, and so on. What is funny is that he also inherits his wife, Asherah. That's why we can see verses in the Bible referring to the statues of Asherah in the temple of Yahweh. But interestingly enough, Yahweh also ends up absorbing Asherah herself, her roles, her symbolism, fertility, blessings, and household protections. The one thing Yahweh lacks now is his radiance, and that comes from absorbing solar imagery from regional sun gods. This is how Marcus Smith makes a comparison in his book In the Early History of God. He translates Psalm 84, verse 12 as, "For Yahweh is a sun and a shield." I don't want to bore you with too many details, but if you are interested, here is a table of solar imagery that Yahweh seemed to absorb over time. I would recommend looking up some of these passages yourself. They are fascinating. So in the end, the early Israelites emerged from the central highlands of Canaan, from a largely Canaanite population, rather than being refugees from Egypt as the Bible describes. So fortunately there was no genocide. However, we can't completely rule out that a small group of maybe a few dozen or more could have come from Egypt and been absorbed into the population. Overall, early Israelite culture looks Canaanite. Their material culture was Canaanite, and their belief system was deeply rooted in the Canaanite world. Interestingly, many scholars also think Yahweh himself may not have originally been a Canaanite deity. Some of the oldest traditions place his origin in the southern regions, Edom, Seir, Midian, or Paran, from where his worship may have been gradually spread into Israel. So yeah, basically this is the story of the origin of Yahweh. And what is fascinating is how a regional pagan cultic warrior deity, originally part of a broader West Semitic religious world, eventually becomes the all-powerful God of Christianity. Of course, this video was only focusing on the origins and the early characteristics. We don't go into how this transformation actually happened, the theological or political and historical processes behind the monotheistic evolution, which was a long and gradual process, taking over half a millennium, 600 to 800 years. I might make a video about the history of this process, so stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Bye.